We begin this episode by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we record and share these stories. We pay our deepest respects to their elders, past and present, and recognise the wisdom, connection, and culture that have shaped these lands for thousands of years. As we journey beyond the veil, we do so with gratitude, respect, and an awareness of those who walked before us, honouring their wisdom, their connection to the land, and their stories woven into the fabric of time. May we listen, learn, and tread lightly, carrying forward their legacy with integrity and heart. Welcome to Beyond the Veil Australia, where history, mystery, and the unexplained collide. From eerie encounters to cryptid lore, from channeled messages to scientific investigations, we're lifting the veil and stepping into the unknown. I'm Heather, your guide through the shadows, and together we'll unravel paranormal phenomena, strange synchronicities, and the mysteries that refuse to be ignored. Whether you're a skeptic, a seeker, or somewhere in between, this space is for you. Fasten your seatbelt, expand your thinking, and get ready to cross the threshold with Beyond the Veil Australia podcast. Witches. Feared, revered, hunted, and misunderstood. For centuries, they've stood at the edge of history, shrouded in myth, cloaked in rebellion, and rooted in ritual. Some call witchcraft folklore, a cautionary tale spun from superstition. Others believe it's a force stitched into the rhythms of nature, lingering just beyond the veil of the everyday. But where did witchcraft begin? Before burnings, before the accusations, before Hollywood gave it its sinister glow, what was the craft? In today's episode, we unravel its origins. From ancient rites etched in clay tablets to goddesses invoked in moonlight, we explore the transformation of witchcraft, its journey from sacred knowledge to feared power. Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Veil Australia podcast. I'm really excited. We just launched the Haunted Locations Part 3 today that I'm recording this, which has been really, really good because there'd been quite a big delay between the release of Part 2 and the release of Part 3. Now that we're settling into the new house, things are just starting to, settle down and you can just kind of start figuring out your routines and things like that. And while I still have 1 week to myself before I start my new job, I wanted to get a head start on recording. So why not do it today? But we are covering witchcraft, which is one of my favorite topics. It's something that I'm very connected with on a personal level and on a spiritual level. So I'm really excited to be able to delve into it a little bit and kind of give you guys a little bit of a taste of the origins and the roots of where witchcraft sort of began, and just kind of go through like a little bit of a timeline type thing where we kind of have a look at where it originated from. My personal favourite is touching a little bit on the witch trials. I'm excited about that. And also kind of looking at sort of where modern witchcraft sits today and seeing how it's evolving. And so this is today's episode. I'm really, really pumped for it. Thank you all again for watching, listening, following along on the social media platforms. It's really nice to see so many people jumping on board and wanting to learn more. So Absolutely fantastic. If you could leave a review or leave a comment on today's episode and maybe just a little bit of a highlight reel of what you found the most fascinating from today's episode. I love being able to hear what you all think and what you've gained in terms of some knowledge. And the other thing that's really helpful, especially on both platforms for watching and listening, is by commenting, liking, sharing, leaving a review. It helps us get noticed by other paranormal enthusiasts that are looking for another podcast to sink their teeth into. If you are somebody that's already reviewed, thank you so much. If you're somebody that's already subscribed, thank you so much. And of course, thank you to everybody that's following along both on socials and through the podcast platforms. So without further ado, let's get stuck into it. Segment 1 is about the ancient roots of witchcraft. One thing I found fascinating in my own personal journey is just some of those little things that you find along the way that, I don't know, it's like the penny drops or, like little light bulb moments. And what I found fascinating is some of the experiences that I've had along with finding that information. It's really quite cool and really fascinating. Let's get stuck in. Segment number 1. Before the word witch was weaponized, before the trials, the burnings, and the whispered curses, there were rituals. Rites passed between generations, carved in memory, drawn into the soil, and whispered through breath. The ancient roots of witchcraft stretch far beyond fear into healing, protection, and survival. Some of the prehistoric belief systems. Long before temples, tombs, or laws, early humans practiced animism, the belief that everything in nature holds spirit. In caves of tens of thousands of years old, we find painted animals on walls, symbolically guiding the hunt, connecting communities to mystical forces. Shamans and healers emerged, acting as spiritual anchors for their tribes. They conducted fire rituals, used bone tools, and carried herbs believed to cure illness and keep evil at bay. These figures, keepers of unseen knowledge, may have been our first witches, although they were never called that. Magic wasn't feared, it was needed. The Temple and the Curse. Around 2000 BCE, in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, magic wasn't subversive. It was institutional. The Asipu were spiritual specialists who worked inside temples, performing healing and protective rituals sanctioned by kings and priests. Clay tablets tell us how spells, known as siptu, were used to cure illness and ward off evil spirits called utaku. These rituals were elaborate. They included chanting, burning effigies, offering sacrifices. One famed collection, the Maklu texts, describe how practitioners would symbolically destroy witches using fire, ash, and incantation, not out of hatred, but to restore balance and health. To speak a spell was to restore order, from sickness to sanity. Isis, healing, and the power of Heka. In ancient Egypt, magic, called Heka, was not fringe. It was divine. Egyptian cosmology taught that Heka existed before creation itself. Priestesses and healers used spells alongside medicine, documented in the scrolls like in the Ebers Papyrus. Goddesses like Isis, who resurrected her husband Osiris, became central figures in both mythology and practical healing. She was invoked during childbirth, illness, even to prevent bleeding. Amulets representing her likeness were worn to protect against harm. In Egypt, magic wasn't feared, it was revered. Greece and Rome, myth and mystery. By the classical period, magical women began to shift from respected healers to feared outsiders. Characters like Medea and Circe, powerful and intelligent, represented defiance in the face of a male-dominated society. Magic lingered in the margins, love spells etched into lead, curses buried beneath temples. One goddess, Hecate, guardian of the crossroads and ghosts, emerged as a sacred figure of witchcraft. She carries torches, keys, and was invoked during moonlit rites, symbolizing choice, transformation, and access to forbidden knowledge. Not all goddesses comfort. Some ignite the unknown. Celtic paganism and the Druids. Across Britain and Ireland, the Druids held deep spiritual authority. They memorized complex astronomical cycles, served as judges and healers, and conducted seasonal rituals to honor the Earth's rhythms. Samhain marked the beginning of the year, when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin. Fires were lit to guide spirits. Herbs were gathered by moonlight. Cunning folk and wise women, often working in rural villages, provided charms, midwifery, and protection from supernatural threats. These weren't witches as we imagine today. They were custodians of seasonal wisdom and ancestral connection. At the edge of firelight, knowledge whispered between worlds. Across continents and centuries, the craft began not as a rebellion, but a relationship. A relationship between human and nature, between fear and healing. Before persecution, before stigma, there was reverence. So when we speak of origins, we speak not of broomsticks and brimstone, but of breath, intention, and the quiet ways knowledge survived. So, what I love about those areas of the origins of witchcraft and the slight cultural differences is that I love that it talks about the fact that as humans, and I think that there's a lot of evidence to support this in terms of petroglyphs and things like that, but in ancient cultures around the world, even in the oldest living culture on the planet, which is First Nations people of Australia, we see petroglyphs with animals and with stories. I know we've briefly covered this in terms of some of the petroglyphs that were found relating to UAP or UFO activity in different ancient civilizations, but it really sort of then lends a little bit of credence to the fact that there's a knowledge of something greater in the universe, but this is how we connect with it on a human level. With witchcraft, it's sort of like we have this ancient knowledge about how to care for ourselves, how to protect ourselves. It's just interesting in the way that if you kind of connect the two a little bit, it's like one's a universal part and one's more of an earthbound part, if that makes sense. And that's what I find really, really fascinating about witchcraft. I think we're learning how to take that term back in its power of witchcraft is not demonic, it's not evil, it's nothing to be feared. I think it's something that needs to be respected. And like anything, if you are religious in some way, or you're spiritual in some way, or you're connected with the universe, whatever that might be, whenever you're undertaking something where you're wanting to connect with your spirituality, with your religion, whatever, it's all about intent, right? So the intent of connecting with something higher is much the same. It's intent with connecting to XYZ. So I think if we think about it, witchcraft is sort of more of the earth, and things like the universal spirituality is kind of, the universe is up here, witchcraft is down here, and then the spirituality kind of helps them intersect a little bit. That's my understanding and my viewpoint of it. You may have a different understanding or viewpoint of it, but I know I say it in every episode, every topic is so massive. And when you really strip it back down, there's always going to be crossovers between different topics because everything is so intersectional. And I think on my personal journey, that's something I've learned as well, is just how connected everything actually is rather than it being just separate sort of topics. So a little bit of food for thought there. So moving into segment 2, which is one that I had a lot of enjoyment in terms of researching and being able to learn a couple of things from it. Not so much that you get enjoyment out of hearing about what was done, it's more enjoyment about learning of different eras and the same kind of belief that went through different points in time, and then knowing things in a more modern context, being able to kind of look back on that and just go, holy shit, that is just like, bleh. But also to be able to see similarities between certain things in those times versus certain things in modern day culture. Um, just very, very interesting. There's a lot of eerie similarities between the way women were viewed then and the way women are viewed now. And whilst you might sit back and look at that and go, okay, well, we've progressed over, 500 years. Well, yes, we have. But I still think that when you really look at it, there's still a lot of similarities when you really pay attention to current day societies. Segment 2, witch trials and persecution. It's kind of cool learning about just how far back things go with witchcrafts. There are some really cool things in there, and just going to give you a little spoiler alert. There is one that's sort of come through this that references to the year 2008. I'll just leave that there and then we will run through this, and yeah, I'm looking forward to jumping into this with you all. In sacred groves and candlelit temples, the craft once thrived, honoured, trusted, passed from hand to hand. But power, especially when worn by outsiders, rarely goes unchallenged. As doctrines hardened and social fear crept in, the wise woman became the outcast. The healer became the heretic. The witch became the hunted. So, religious shifts and demonization of magic. In early medieval Europe, Christianity began reshaping spiritual identity. Rituals not sanctioned by the church were rebranded, not as misguided, but as demonic. The canon episcopi, I can't even say that properly, sorry, a 10th century clerical text, condemned women who claimed to fly with Diana, the Roman moon goddess. These weren't accusations of casting spells, but accusations of holding beliefs. To imagine was sin. To believe was betrayal. Then came 1487, the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, authored by Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer. It argued that witchcraft was real, inherently female, and a threat to divine order. Midwives and healers were portrayed as corrupted by the lust and the spiritual weakness. This book spread rapidly, second only to the Bible in popularity, and it became the theological cornerstone of Europe's witch hunts. The machinery of trials and torture. Across centuries, and continents, suspicion became law. Once accused, there was little escape. Witch trials operated as spectacle and strategy, a mix of religious zealotry, legal theatre, and psychological torment. Victims were stripped, shaved, and pricked for witches' marks. These are birthmarks or blemishes that are believed to be the signs of a demonic pact. Some of the torture tools included thumb screws and racks, the witch's bridle, a gag fitted with spikes to silence demonic speech. Water trials where drowning meant innocence and survival meant guilt. Pain became the language through which innocence was denied. Those sound like pretty fucking horrific forms of control, coercion, torture, pain, all of that. It's just, yuck. And even as it was saying that book ran second in terms of popularity to the Bible, and it was spreading misinformation and basically saying that, it's evil, it's not okay. And that one thing, it's slight food for thought here, and this is just a thought process I've had a little bit over the last couple of days when really delving into this. I've come across some things about this that, with my thought process, make perfect sense. And I guess you could think about it in a modern context as well. But with Christianity, as it just mentioned, my understanding is that Christianity utilized a lot of paganism, but rebranded it. And as it said before, it's been rebranded, but it's been rebranded as these specific things are demonic and not to be toyed with. And so if you think about it in a modern type of thing, is that you would liken it to things like propaganda, where you put forth an ideology, and when you know things are blatant lies, you will construe them in a way that really hooks somebody in. You're speaking to somebody not just on a physical level, but you're getting into where those little hooks are to be able to pull them in and brainwash, essentially. And what do we do with when we know that our propaganda, for example, is a lie? Instead of acknowledging that we've been inspired by something else, for example, we demonize it. So it's like when you have, and for those that are content creators, you have people that follow, love, enjoy what you do, and then you're going to have haters. What's a hater's main purpose? To try and discredit what somebody does. And how do they go about hating? By using things to demonize, right? So it's knowing full well within themselves that they've got no reason to hate other than their own personal whatevers, but they're of course going to try and demonize whatever it is. So it's much like that with Christianity. Is it's like, well, we've taken a lot of the paganism value systems and beliefs, but we're going to rebrand them into the way that we like, and we're going to demonize all of that because we don't want people knowing that we've actually stolen it. And by doing that, we can now recreate what good and what evil is. And one thing that I think about, particularly on my journey, is, and this is, I mean, I don't know if this just comes with different levels of ascension in terms of maybe a spiritual awakening, but I think when you think about an ideology, a religion, spirituality, whatever it might be, when you really start to look into it with an open mind, you may start to find that all of them have started from somewhere of goodness to be able to highlight good. But instead of understanding that evil is usually from human to human, it's not necessarily coming from that specifically. I think it comes down to that propaganda thing again, where here's what we believe to be good, and here's how we can pull out bits and pieces that we may not personally agree with, demonize them, and create them as evil, saying that people do this are evil. But you look at some of these people that, I guess if you want to say, do evil things like human to human, they want to hide behind a belief, but they're quite happy to demonize people that aren't actually doing the wrong thing, and they're trying to be good human beings and they do good in the world. But you've got people that hide behind that going, well, I'm a really good person, yet I've gone and done all these atrocities. Does that make sense? Like, they're just little thought processes that I've had. So it's just interesting. I think witchcraft is one of those topics that really highlights, if you really, really strip it back in the history, you can really see how different layers of history in more modern times have sort of eventuated. If it's something that you have more knowledge on, let me know. I think this is what I like about having the podcast, is that we get to explore topics, but we get to really start having thought processes behind what our understandings of those topics are. And I think everybody's going to have a different level of knowledge, and I think that that's something that should be really embraced and not utilized for putting people down. I think in order for us to have a better understanding, we need to be educated. And if we're educated in a way where we're open to continue to grow, I think that's a really good thing. What I've learned with witchcraft is that that's kind of what it's trying to say, is that for thousands of years before religion really became a thing, we were connected to the earth, we lived off the earth, we connected with animals, all those sorts of things, and we've survived. So there must be something there where now we're starting to really remember that. I don't think that it's necessarily that we're learning something completely new. I think it's just that we've been able to adjust and remember. So again, food for thought there. That's just my thought process. I'm curious to hear what other people might think. But to kind of keep going on where we were, I've got some notable cases of some of these trials and persecutions. So the first of which is Isabel Gowdy in Scotland of 1662, a housewife who gave detailed confessions of flying through the air, shape-shifting, and attending sabbats. Her case is among the most vividly documented, although her fate is actually unknown. Alice Kittler, Ireland, 1324. Accused of poisoning her husband and consorting with a spirit named Robin Artisan, she fled. Her maid, Petronella de Meath, was flogged and burned alive. She actually became Ireland's first witch execution. The Pendle Witches in England of 1612. Triggered by a cursed peddler and local superstition, 10 people were hanged. Poor, elderly, and isolated. Their story reveals how folklore, poverty, and fear actually fed the fire of persecution. Agnes Sampson, Scotland, 1590. Accused of conjuring storms to drown King James VI, she was tortured, shaved, and executed. Her case fueled Scotland's witch panic for decades. Interesting. One thing I find really interesting with that is that, as it mentioned before, it's predominantly a female group. We'll just say group. So it's just interesting that pretty much everyone here is female. To my knowledge, all of the Pendle witches were female. But again, some things are documented, some things are not. So interesting to see how that happens. But it also is interesting, particularly with the Pendle witches, that 10 people were hanged and their backgrounds were that they were either poor, they were elderly, or they were isolated. So to me, if I switch from my paranormal way of thinking to my professionally trained way of thinking, is that we're picking on a marginalised community, aren't we? Just saying, well, they're easy targets, right? It's like, okay, the patriarchy that was in charge of everything was kind of like, we want to set ourselves up to be whatever. How do we get through that the easiest way possible? Who do we target? The people that don't always necessarily have an opportunity to defend themselves or to fight back. So just interesting there. But now we're looking at the psychology of persecution. So this will probably go a little bit more into what we were literally just talking about. But what made someone a witch? Often poverty, age, independence, or simply being somebody different. Widows, herbalists, and midwives, including healers, were also easy targets. Gossip and envy fueled accusations. If there was one wrong glance, one misfortune nearby, then the suspicion grew. Trials offered communal catharsis during moments of plague, war, or famine. Interesting how it's just talking about when there's large-scale events and you have a patriarchy trying to dictate how and what to do with things, and it's predominantly women being persecuted. Just an interesting thought, because I think, unfortunately, the world hasn't grown enough to not be dicks like that. It's just really interesting that yes, as a society we've grown, but there's also a lot of stuff that we're going through right now that is still very relatable in a modern day, which is, it's sad. I thought we were better than that. Fear needed a face. Folklore helped justify the cruelty. The devil's mark, a mole or a scar, said to feed familiar spirits like toads, cats, or crows. Mole Dyer, a Maryland legend. A reclusive woman driven from her home, found frozen to a rock, arm raised in a final curse. Bridget Bishop of Salem was accused not for spells, but for wearing bright clothes and hosting social games. Her crime wasn't her witchcraft, it was her refusal to conform. Modern historians view these trials as ritualized displacement, social anxieties that have been projected onto those least protected. The legacy and decline of the trials. By the 18th century, the flames began to flicker out. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Locke denounced superstition. Laws changed. Scotland repealed the Witchcraft Act in 1736, and Salem's trials were condemned by 1702. Yet the myth persisted. Witches became fairy tale villains, horror icons, and misunderstood outlaws. Some of the cases with long echoes. Anna Gouldy of Switzerland, 1782, executed for allegedly causing a child to vomit pins. Her conviction was overturned in 2008. Rosaline Norton, Australia, 1940s to 50s. Dubbed the Witch of King's Cross, her occult art and pagan rituals scandalised Sydney. Though never tried, she was hounded by police and press. Aradia, 1899. A folkloric gospel of Italian witchcraft. Aradia, daughter of the goddess Diana, taught magic to the poor and helping them resisting oppression through ritual. They buried the stories, but the symbols never stopped speaking. The witch trials were not only about magic, they were about control, about silencing independence and rewriting wisdom as wickedness. But even in ash, something remained, a whisper, a truth passed down beneath the surface. The craft was never extinguished. It waited. It remembered. It was ready to rise again. That's a little bit about the trials and the persecutions of the witchcraft. Really interesting how just in between each little spot we were able to kind of put some thoughts out there and see what we actually thought about it. And it is interesting. History will repeat itself until the lesson has been learned. We are going to move on to segment 3, modern witchcraft, spirituality, and reclamation. The witch has walked through fire, branded, buried, and burned. And still, she speaks. Not all stories survive persecution, but some, carried in shadow and passed between hands, emerge stronger. Modern witchcraft is not the revival of danger. It's a resurgence of dignity, of choice, of remembering who we were before we were told what to fear. Reviving the craft, spiritual renaissance and cultural memory. As the 19th century unwrapped industrial progress and colonial expansion, something else stirred, an ache to remember. Folklorists began collecting oral traditions, mystics revisited ancient scripts, and disenfranchised voices searched for spiritual autonomy. Aradia, Gospel of the Witches, Italy, 1899. Compiled by Charles Leland, Aradia is both legend and manifesto. Diana's daughter teaches witchcraft to the poor, encouraging rebellion through spellwork and spiritual independence. Though its origins are contested, it offered inspiration to those seeking non-Christian paths rooted in empowerment. The rise of Wicca, 1950s to 60s. Gerald Gardner introduced Wicca as a living tradition, blending ceremonial magic, folk practices, and reverence for nature. Sabbats like Samhain and Beltane marked the wheel of the year, cyclical rituals of life, death, and rebirth. Ritual tools and invocations helped modern witches structure their practice with intention. Other influences: Theosophy, Hermetism, and Druidry also resurged, emphasizing cosmology, inner alchemy, and ancestral connection. Feminist spirituality explored the divine feminine and goddess archetypes in contrast to patriarchal religious systems. Where spirituality once lived only in temples and sermons, it now bloomed in gardens, poetry, and personal ritual. The practice today: diverse, decentralized, devotional. Modern witchcraft defies a single definition. It's fluid, intimate, and culturally diverse. Eclectic and solitary witches mix and adapt practices through moon cycles, astrology, crystal grids, elemental magic. Work alone or within small circles, emphasizing intuition, experimentation, and self-reflection. Intersectional witchcraft: embrace the craft as a tool of self-affirmation and resistance. Challenge colonial and gendered structures, reclaiming ancestor worship, body sovereignty, and inclusive ritual. Hoodoo, Karundaismo, African traditional religions, and indigenous practices are being reinterpreted by descendants with reverence and research. Folk and cultural magic: resurgence of Italian stegonera, Slavic zarod, Mexican brujeria, and Irish keening. These traditions were often matrilineal and entangled with herbalism, Saint Veronician, and oral storytelling. Techno-paganism and digital covens: practitioners live stream rituals, design apps for spell tracking, and participate in witch talk communities. This democratizes the craft while complicating authenticity. raising conversations about cultural appropriation and responsible sharing. The broom has traded for camera, the altar for an algorithm, but the magic, the intention, remains. Archetypes and the reclamation of power. The witch, once the villain, now the vessel. From folklore to feminist icon, pop culture reclaims her through nuance, such as The Love Witch, Practical Magic, and Sabrina, stories that show trauma, strength, and transformation. The witch aesthetic has grown from black hats, candles, and runes, but beneath it lies the reclaiming of knowledge once banned. Shadow work and healing. Modern witchcraft emphasizes integration, working with inner wounds, ancestral grief, suppressed truths. Shadow work rituals include journaling, meditation, sigils, or offerings to those lost in generational erasure. The witch as the mirror. She doesn't ask you to believe, she asks you to reflect. What are your truths? What will you name? What will you no longer silence? Calling oneself witch is not just a label, it's a spell, a declaration of survival, synthesis, and self. Ritual as resistance, magic as memory. Today's practitioners light candles to manifest clarity or gather under full moons to charge affirmations. But these acts are layered. They are remembrance. They are resistance. A spell jar becomes a declaration, such as, I deserve protection. A tarot reading becomes ancestral dialogue. What wisdom have I forgotten? A group ritual becomes a chosen family. We are still here. Cultural healing. Descendants of those persecuted reclaim magic not for entertainment, but to mend historic fractures. Practitioners seek truth, not just in crystals or incense, but in archive, oral history, and restored identity. The craft lives in every act of remembering, every choice to create meaning in a world that once demanded silence. The witch does not belong to the past. She lives in every threshold we cross, with intention, with courage, with fire. She is not here to frighten. She is here to guide. In spell and story, in circle and solitude, modern witchcraft rises, not as an escape, but as a rival. It is not a rebellion, it is a return. So there we go. There's a little bit about where we're sitting with modern witchcraft, some of the different types of witches and warlocks out there. I know from my own personal experience, I'm a bit of a combination of all of those. There are certain things from each of those categories that I think before I realized it was witchcraft, I was already sort of doing anyway. And the reason I say I was already sort of doing them was because, and again, this is a topic I'm going to cover later on, but with mental health, a lot of the types of self-therapy that workers that you may engage with when needing support will guide you into the sense of journaling, of meditation, finding something that makes you feel safe. It's about feeling safe. With some of the modern styles is that a lot of that is very much used in terms of spiritual ascension and growth. For me, with my experience, was not only was it trying to combat something with managing mental health, but it's also growing and ascending in a spiritual manner. Really interesting to cover off some of those things. I know that we've been on a really big roller coaster today. We've kind of started in where the origins were. We've also looked at some of the trials. I think some of those people that we've mentioned in the trials and persecution segment, I think it would be really interesting to do a couple of deep dives sort of right into them and see. I don't think their stories get told. And I think that's something that needs to be done. And I think particularly as we're looking at ascension and growth with rediscovering and remembering witchcraft and our connections to it from ancestral ties and just as humanity in general, I think it'd be really good to revisit those and learn more about it. I'll be keen to see what you guys think of this episode. It's one that's very dear and personal to me, and I know that witchcraft is not for everyone, but I hope that even if it's not your cup of tea, I hope that you've learned something fascinating today that maybe got you thinking a little bit more about it, and whether you slowly open up to it or whether you just say, nah, that's not for me and move on. That's okay. As long as something came out of today's episode that you found interesting, that's awesome. The witch was never just a woman in the shadow. She was a story, twisting through time, burned into memory, and buried beneath centuries of silence. In today's episode, we remembered her truth, healer, guide, keeper of ancient knowing. But stories evolve, and some shift with intention. Others are twisted by fear. In our next episode, The Legends and the Fear, we enter the darker woods of folklore. We'll walk beside the women who dwell in caves and crossroads, the ones whispered about at bedtime, the ones who became symbols of danger in tales designed to warn. How did these stories reshape the witch into something monstrous? What do these legends say about the world that created them? Because fear doesn't just silence, it reshapes. And every myth leaves behind a mirror. Until then, keep your fire lit. Some stories still whisper when the wind begins to turn. Again, a massive thank you to you all for tuning in, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify. And also, just wanted to make a mention that my beautiful special guest, Salem, my special little squishy pumpkin, was present for today's episode. And I also dug up a t-shirt that I've actually got 4 of from my wardrobe. I got it from Shein or Temu, I can't remember, but it says, "Witch Please." And that was the inspiration for the name of this particular mini-series, Witch Please. So there you go. For each episode, I'm going to wear a different one. So if you listen on Spotify and you want to watch on YouTube, head on over. You'll be able to see my cool little t-shirt, and of course you'll be able to see Salem. He does make it into some episodes. He was in the Haunted Locations Part 3, but I did forget to actually introduce him, so that's my bad. But again, same thing, I forgot to introduce him at the start of this episode. Once again, thank you all for joining me, and I hope you have an awesome week. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Bye!